Hello and welcome to Data Visualizations that Convey Meaning, a webinar for leaders in the AmeriCorps VISTA program. I'm your host, Andy King, a Senior Training Specialist at AmeriCorps VISTA, and I'm pleased to introduce you to our presenter, Gina Cartazone. Gina is a community and cultural psychologist who conducts quantitative and qualitative analysis with the Sheryl Sandberg and Dave Goldberg Family Foundation, which is home of leanin.org and optionb.org. Gina also has experience working with the VISTA training team, designing, administering, and analyzing surveys of VISTA members and leaders. So Gina, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Andy. I'm excited to have this opportunity to talk about how to make data visualizations that convey meaning. I'm known for getting way too enthusiastic about charts, and I look forward to sharing that with you. So what are we going to cover today? Let's look at our session outcomes. First, we'll look at identifying two purposes of data visualization. Next, you'll be able to list the steps for creating a data visualization. And finally, you'll apply data visualization principles to make your representations accessible and meaningful. So just to start off, what can you tell me about this just from looking at it? My guess is that there's not much that you can tell from a glance. This has to do with the number of employees in Arizona non-government sectors, and there are big differences between sectors. These data, by the way, and much of the data throughout this webinar are from a 2016 report on the nonprofit sector in Arizona State, which is linked to in the resources and in the handout. Now, what can you tell me from this chart? Right away, you can see some things more clearly. Retail trade is the sector with the greatest number of employees, while mining, quarrying, oil, and gas has the least. However, there's still a lot of information to take in, and it's hard to know what's important. Now, what can you tell me about the data? We see here that nonprofits are Arizona's fifth largest non-government employer. Of course, the title helps, but the visual has also been redesigned to draw attention to and reinforce the main message.
All right, so already we have a quick activity in which we're going to ask you to respond to a question in the chat. Gina showed us three visuals, a spreadsheet, a chart, and then a redesigned chart. So what made this last one easier to understand? And again, so that everyone can see your response, please select everyone before you submit. All right, so we're seeing a couple of things come in already. A few of you are mentioning color, order, right? Organizing it from the biggest or the most to the least. Adding that title, contrasting color gives emphasis, makes it easier to focus on a particular data point. Labeling was enhanced there, the ranking. All right, so I see a lot of you are on to some of the same ideas here. Gina, what do you think? Anything that stands out for you there?
Yeah, they've got it. So the first thing that was done was this was converted from, a vertical to a horizontal layout, which is a lot easier to read. You don't have those slanted labels. Then it was ordered from largest to smallest, which is a lot easier to take in. Some of the grid lines and other kinds of things were replaced with direct labels. And as many of you noted, the nonprofit bar was colored to really draw your eye to that piece and underscore the title and point of this. So thanks. Yeah, everyone got it. Having things in order, using color purposefully are huge points that I will that help people to process visualizations. Okay, so what we're really talking about here is turning data into knowledge. Collecting and analyzing data is time and labor intensive, and data is only useful if people can make sense of it. Turning data into knowledge requires understanding and sharing meaningful insights. And just a quick note that when I say data, I usually mean both quantitative data, that is numbers, or qualitative data, which can come from interviews or other sources. In this presentation, we'll use examples from quantitative data because this is where visualizations can often make the most impact. But there are some really interesting ways to visualize qualitative data, and there's more info about that in the resources section. Why is data visualization a good way of conveying meaning? Well, a large amount of our brain is devoted to visual processing, so we can absorb a lot of information quickly when we present things visually. This means that we can pack a lot of information in a small space. And you can maintain the richness, complexity of data while also driving home certain points and potentially having a greater emotional impact. This is another similar question. What's more meaningful, this chart or this spreadsheet? Different formats have different strengths and are suited to different tasks. However, when it comes to data, it's often easier to convey meaning with visual aids. Here, once again, we have information arranged in a spreadsheet. And when you compare that with a clearly labeled and intentionally defined chart, you see that the data has been arranged so that it has meaning. Now, what's more impactful, text or visual? Text can be very rich and compelling, but that really depends on whether people are willing to take the time to read it. So text is important, but it's a good complement to data visualizations. Now, what's more informative, a chart or a factoid? Rather than having a wall of text, you can have a factoid. That's just a single piece of data that's emphasized. Here we have one that says more than 72% of nonprofit revenue is generated by earned revenue, fees for services, and government contracts, not from philanthropic contributions. It's meaningful and impactful and certainly easy to understand. However, it loses a lot of the complexity and richness of the data. It's not as informative. Here, the chart gives you the bottom line, but it shows you how much money is coming from each major source. Like the bunch of text, it can be paired with the factoid, but the data visualization has an advantage of being able to convey meaning, to be impactful and easy to understand while still being rich and informative. And again, all three of these were perfectly reasonable ways to have information, but the data visualization is just unique in its ability to convey a lot of information while also being very clear if it's designed well. Now let's talk about the steps involved in data visualization. There are two phases to this process. In phase one, you're preparing. These are all the steps that you should take before you begin to actually make your viz. Step one is to understand your audience. Step two is to find your purpose. And step three is select your data. Once you've taken these steps, you're ready for phase two, design and refine. So step four is choosing your format or formats. Step five is drafting your visualizations. And step six is iterating, which you can do after gathering feedback or after simply making your own assessment of whether the visualization is accomplishing its intended purpose. First, we're going to go through phase one, prepare. The first step, as with many other things, is to understand your audience. Who are you trying to reach? In your work, it may be funders, staff, policymakers, community members, the media, or others. Once you know who you want to reach, you can consider what they'll likely want to see. Do they want to know more or less? Do they want to know your point of view or just the facts? And always consider accessibility. Andy?
All right, so we'd like to hear from you again. In the chat, please share out which kinds of audiences you are working with, or you can include those that you might be sharing data with in the future. So remember to send to everyone so we can see all of your responses. All right, we've got board members, community members, stakeholders, nonprofit team members, my boss. That's always a good one, right? You have an important audience there. Wow, lawyers and judges, city leaders, members of the general public, neighborhood associations, potential recruits. So maybe incoming VISTAs or volunteers, other staff, colleagues, donors, an important one, and I think we'll maybe see some more information about that donor data that we looked at already. So yeah, a real wide variety of audiences here. Gina, any thoughts about all of these audiences?
Yeah, I mean, there's usually there's more than one audience, so that's something to keep in mind. And but yeah, in your case, a lot of times you're talking to board members, you're talking to the community, and the way that you present information may change slightly depending on who you're talking to and also how you're talking to them. You probably want to include more detail in a report, for instance, than in a presentation. Or if you include detail in a presentation, you want to make sure that it's something that people can grasp very quickly. So it's great to see what kinds of audiences you're sharing data with, and that's just always great to keep top of mind whenever you get started on something like this. So there are overall accessibility concerns that are relevant for all audience members. For example, how will they be looking at this? On a computer? Will their computer look like yours? Or will they be printing this out? Is there a chance this may be printed out in grayscale? And how would that affect your visualization? Does the language fit the audience? Is there too much jargon? Does it need to be translated into other languages? There are also accessibility concerns that are specific to making sure that your visualizations are accessible for people with visual impairments. A sizable portion of the population is colorblind. So ideally, you would want to create visualizations that are still meaningful for people who can't distinguish green from red, for example. Some portion of you might not see that there's an orange 6 among the green background here. People who use screen readers due to visual impairments should still be able to have some idea of what your visualization is trying to convey. If your content isn't optimized for that, you can be unintentionally excluding people with disabilities. At the very least, this means using clear labeling, but there are additional steps you can take, especially when working with web content, that can help ensure that people have equal access to the information you're trying to share. If you work with the federal government, you may hear about 508 compliance. And this refers to a law that's concerned with making digital content available to people with disabilities. There are 508 compliance checklists and tools that can help you assess whether your content is suited for people with disabilities. This is a huge topic, so I've included a resource on the handout to learn more about this. Step 2 is define your purpose. We want you to define your specific purpose, but more broadly, you also want to understand which type of visualization you're creating. We can separate data visualizations into 2 major types. One has an editorial purpose, where you're conveying a point of view. You're drawing attention to some aspect of the data. Then there are visualizations where the purpose is really information, which is when the audience wants to make their own inferences. In this case, you tend to include a lot more information. You may even have something like an interactive dashboard that allows people to play with the data and find what interests them. You tend to use much more neutral language and let people make judgments about what they find meaningful or interesting. Here's an example of the chart we looked at before, showing that nonprofits are Arizona's 5th largest non-government employer. I would call this editorial because it is trying to get a specific point across, because of the title and the way that the visual is designed to draw your attention to a specific point. Now here's the same data with a more informational presentation, which is exactly the same in most ways, but has more neutral language in the title and doesn't use color to draw attention in the same way. It maintains other aspects of the original chart redesign, like making it a bar chart instead of vertical columns so that category labels are readable, directly labeling the values, and arranging in order from largest to smallest to make it easier to scan and quickly make comparisons. Sometimes for informational visualizations, you may want to add back grid lines or other elements that make it a little less streamlined and pretty, but that are desired by your audience or useful for 508 compliance. Step 3 is selecting your data. There is usually too much data. And sorry, sometimes I say data, sometimes I say data, I don't know why. But especially when you're creating something that is editorial, and so you're trying to convey a point of view, a lot of your process is going to be about what you choose to share and what you choose not to. So what will you include and what will you exclude? And you may choose to include everything in an appendix of some sort if you're making a report, But when making visuals, you want to be selective and choose the data that will fulfill your purpose and connect with your audience. You may also want to look at whether there are group differences or trends over time you want to show. And consider whether additional analyses are needed first. Often data is not compiled or formatted in the most useful way, so your preparation may include things like combining categories, playing with the way the data is formatted, or in some cases, even doing statistical analyses. For editorial visualizations, one useful exercise is asking yourself the question, if I were going to write a headline, what would it be? And we can think back to our example being that nonprofits were the 5th largest non-governmental employer. Returning to the example chart we showed before, during the preparation phase, we may know that we want a headline that emphasizes that, counter to popular thinking, most nonprofit revenue is not actually from contributions and gifts. This helped us select a subset of data so that we could create a straightforward and easy to understand visual that supports that point. Alternately, this visual from the original report from Arizona includes the same data on the left side, but then breaks down the category of earned income into things like membership fees, events, and services or sales. This is a more informative visual, but as you can see, it has more of an informational feel with lots of data and more neutral language in the titles. Now you're ready for the next phase, design and refine. Of course, like most creative processes, you may return to the previous phase to reconsider which data you're selecting or thinking about new headline along the way. But for now, you're ready to actually start creating data visualizations. So step 4 is choosing your formats. And this is very broad version of formats. So in this presentation, we'll mostly be talking about static charts, the kinds of things you would see in a report or slide deck, and that matches what people said early in the presentation when asked, where will you be presenting this? Most people said meetings and reports. But there are other forms like interactive dashboards, or if you have some graphic design skills, an infographic that combines multiple pieces of information into one. There are a ton of other ways to share data, like videos or simulations, or like this image shows, a mural on a wall. When considering the format, it really depends on your audience and how you plan to deliver the information. In most cases, static charts get the job done, and pretty much anyone can do them with Excel or Google Sheets, while other formats may take more time and expertise. Step 5 is the design stage. The key thing here is to take an experimental approach. You may begin with a default suggested chart, for instance, from Excel, but then you want to consider what changes you can make so that the visualization achieves your purpose. You always want to be focused on your purpose. What do you want your audience to understand? If you have an editorial viz, try starting with a headline. Step 6 is to iterate. This goes hand in hand with the experimental approach. Your first version of a viz is probably not going to be your final version. If you can, share the drafts and get feedback, ideally from people who resemble your audience. But if that's not possible, even a colleague would work. This step is especially important if you're doing something that's very high stakes, something that's going to policymakers or funders, for example, or something that you plan to share with the media. In a report or slide deck, you may have a dozen or more charts, but you don't necessarily have to go through this process individually for each one. You may have 2 or 3 templates that you're working with, and you can gather feedback on all of them at the same time. Whether or not you can get external feedback, you can iterate on your own by thinking about your purpose and by considering the degree to which your initial visualizations follow data visualization principles. So let's talk about data visualization principles. This is an important topic, so it's getting its own section, but it's really something that's interwoven into steps 5 and 6 when you're designing and iterating. So what are the principles or some of the principles of data visualization? 1 is less is usually more. 2, use color effectively. 3, know what formats, for example, what chart types work best with your data. And 4, always put the audience first. I'll say this a few times because it's just that important. These are not exhaustive, but if you get these 4 right, you can vastly improve your visuals. So let's talk about how less is usually more. You want to eliminate chart junk. In data visualization literature, you'll see the actual words chart junk, as well as complicated sounding things like data to ink or data to pixel ratio. These all refer to the same things, and no, there is no need to actually calculate any ratios. Basically, it means you want everything in your visual to be meaningful and to eliminate unnecessary visual clutter that may just distract the audience. Think Marie Kondo, only instead of getting rid of things that don't spark joy, you're getting rid of things that don't add meaning. Here in this image, we see that 3D grid lines and non-helpful labels like 1, 2, 3 are all deemed unnecessary extra information. This is chart junk, and you should get rid of it. Ideally, you can get rid of legends as well and directly label wherever possible, which will reduce frustration and improve your audience's experience. There are exceptions to this, especially when you're making an infographic or something with a very strong editorial point of view. Sometimes it makes sense to add things that are not strictly necessary for giving people an accurate sense of the data, but that are there for emphasis and/or emotional impact. Additional lines or colors, or even complex visual metaphors can sometimes be worth including in an editorial visualization if they help get your main point across. This image was actually taken from a data visualization book as an example of unnecessary chart junk. But that's not actually fair. And there was later an article published about the ways that visual embellishment like this can sometimes make things more comprehensible and memorable. In this case, the purpose is not necessarily to give people accurate data in the most efficient way possible. It's to convey a message in an impactful and memorable way. And I think it's more successful at doing this than a standard chart would be. The next principle is to use color effectively. Color should enhance and draw attention, not overwhelm or distract. Here again, we have the chart we looked at earlier, which uses color in a very purposeful way. Everything is gray except for the one data point that we want people to look at, showing that nonprofits are Arizona's 5th largest non-government employer. On the right, we have a can we put that on the right? Okay. On the right, we have a variation that has more visual variety and looks pretty, but it's not drawing your attention to anything in an intentional way. Moreover, it actually could be confusing or misleading because there's repetition of colors that doesn't actually have any meaning. Our brains want to make meanings from patterns. And so we may look at this and our eyes will go right to the orange and then try to make sense of what the category of orange represents, when actually it's not a category at all. You could fix this by just making every category a different color, and occasionally that makes sense, but it would probably be visually overwhelming and not very useful. Generally, it's helpful to use multiple shades of the same color when there's a relationship between elements, and different colors when you have wholly different categories to emphasize the differences. But you want to always be intentional about your use of color so it's still easy to look at. Next, know what works with your data and what doesn't. Look at this chart. Does it look familiar? This is the exact same data that was on the previous page, but it's in a format, a pie chart, that is an especially poor fit for something with this many categories. Most of the time, a pie chart is not the answer. There's only a few times when it makes sense. When you're creating charts, knowing what works with your data includes having a basic understanding of what kinds of charts typically work well with which types of data. Here we have 2 different data types, parts of a whole and simple comparisons. These tend to work best with different types of charts. One type of data is parts of a whole. Oh, sorry, that was a little typo there. The simplest data type is a simple comparison. This is when you are comparing multiple categories across one dimension. For example, when we looked at the number of employees in each sector in Arizona, this was a simple comparison. Basic chart types you can use for simple comparison are standard bar charts or column charts. Our chart showing employees in each sector in Arizona, that's a bar chart. And here's a column chart. They're basically the same, just one is horizontal and one is vertical. Excel considers all of these to be column charts, but it helps to think of them as a little different because there are times when one type fits the data better than others. Horizontal bar charts tend to be especially useful when you have many categories, as they allow you to read all the category names easily. Here, I have fewer categories in the column chart because otherwise the labels would be much harder to read. Another common data type is parts of a whole. This is when the data points all add up to 100%. It doesn't have to actually use percentages, though it usually does, but it means that everything is part of one larger category. For example, if you said 26% of VISTA leaders say one thing and 74% say another, you are talking about parts of a whole. Basic chart types for this include stacked column or bar charts, where all parts add up to 100%. You can also use regular columns or bars and look at things as a simple comparison, especially if there are a lot of categories. Stacked column or bars look good up to about 5 categories and then get a little more challenging. They can be great for looking at survey responses on a 5-point scale. You see here a stacked column chart and a stacked bar chart. They're just variations on each other. Both the stacked bar and column charts have the advantage that it's pretty easy to have more than one at once. So for example, if you have 3 survey questions that are all on a 5-point scale, you can easily make one visual with multiple bars. Another popular type of chart for parts of a whole are pie charts or donut charts. These tend to be good when you have 2 or 3 categories, but can get problematic if you have many more categories than this. You see examples of a pie chart and a donut chart. A donut is a variation on a pie that is a little more elegant looking and maybe a little easier to understand. One common problem that I see is the one I presented earlier, when people use chart types that are meant for parts of a whole, like pie charts, for different data types. Generally, you can use chart types meant for simple comparisons for this type of data, but you shouldn't do the reverse. Stay away from stacked bars and pies if your data doesn't add up to 100%. And this is a deep dive into charts, so I hope you're ready for this. So getting a little more complicated, we have simple 2-way comparisons. These are comparisons of 2 groups across multiple categories. For example, using some data from the Women in the Workplace report I worked on this past year, we can look at microaggressions by gender. And we're using 2 genders here to draw comparisons, but we know that gender is not binary. Basic chart types for this are clustered column or bar charts. These are native to Excel, so you can make them fairly easily. Here's a clustered column chart. The gray columns represent men leaders, the blue women leaders. And here's a clustered bar chart. Now we get into more complicated data types when we look at multiple comparisons. These are comparisons of 3 or more groups across multiple categories or looking at 3 or more dimensions. For example, we can take the data from the last slide and add a dimension to look at microaggressions by binary gender by job level. Basic chart types for this include clustered column or bar charts, though you have to be more thoughtful with these than with simpler comparisons. Here you see clustered column charts where I've changed the color scheme so that it's a little more obvious, and there are 2 subcategories: entry level men and women and senior level men and women. And here's a variation of a clustered column chart where we have the categories and subcategories of employees directly labeled. Another way of representing this type of data is just with the table. This can be the easiest way to present data, and you can use conditional formatting to make differences more obvious. Here's the same data in a conditionally formatted table. Another option for complex data like this is to use small multiples. I'll show some examples of that later, but it basically involves breaking data down into smaller subsets and using the same type of chart multiple times. This makes it easy for people to make visual comparisons. This is sort of borderline basic, and everything else is basic, meaning it's native to Excel. You can probably do it in Google Sheets and other basic software. It doesn't involve graphic design skill. I would say that small multiples are sort of borderline basic because Excel doesn't make it super easy to represent the data this way, but you can just make multiple charts yourself and arrange them. Finally, we have change over time. This refers to data that shows data over multiple time points. For example, you could look at the number of VISTA members in a region over the course of several years. This is actually just a simple comparison, but it can be helpful to treat time-based data a little differently. When you have several time points, your best bet is often a line chart. Here you have a line chart with fake data comparing the number of VISTA leaders in Group A and Group B. I've made one of the lines dashed, so you have one more way of distinguishing them if you're looking at this in grayscale. Line charts are great for showing trends over time. You may notice that I left the grid lines in and didn't directly label any of the data points. This is because I'm assuming that viewers are most interested in seeing the change over time and don't care as much about individual data points. Here you see a clear trend where group B started off low but rose steadily over time, while team A started high but wavered. Bar or column charts, including clustered bar or column charts, can also be used with time data, especially when you only have 2 or 3 categories. A line chart is pretty underwhelming with 2 time points, and using a bar or column makes it a little easier to label data points. Here's an example of a clustered bar chart using only the data from 2020 to 2021. It's easy enough to see that group B increased a bit while group A decreased by a lot. However, if you added many more time points here, it would be a lot harder to observe the trend, and you'd be better off with a line chart. In these last several slides, as I mentioned, I focused primarily on charts that are very easy to create using Excel or Google Sheets and don't require advanced graphic design skills or a ton of time. However, for those of us who really want to get into charts, I'm going to quickly provide examples in the next bunch of slides of other ways data can be represented. And Excel may add these eventually. These are all taken from the last few years of Women in the Workplace reports. We have amazing designers at leanin.org, and collaborating with them to make charts is a data viz nerd dream come true. So here we have a lollipop chart, which is just like a column chart or clustered column chart, but a little less overwhelming to look at. These are upside down lollipops. And here's an example with the lollipops right side up. Next, we have nested shapes, which can be very versatile when you're doing comparisons. Here we have nested circles showing the data we looked at earlier, with microaggressions by gender and by level. This is actually an example of small multiples, because when you're using the same chart type multiple times, rather than trying to squeeze all this into one clustered bar chart, that's a small multiple. It's a lot easier to digest. And here's, can you advance? Okay. Here's a nested donut showing a simple comparison of the percentage of companies that set gender targets for senior versus junior management. This is a butterfly or tornado chart. Please click. Thank you. This is a butterfly or tornado chart, which can be especially useful when doing two-way comparisons like we had here. And there are also barbells, which allow you to compare multiple points without having overwhelming clustered bar charts. This can be really great for showing before and after data. This is a scatter plot, which you use often when doing statistical analyses, but usually isn't the easiest to grasp. It's another way to show complex data. These are bubble charts where the numbers are represented in the area of the circle. This can be useful as alternatives to clustered bar charts or tables. And this particular chart is another example of small multiples. You can also plot bubbles on a grid or scatter plot style chart to show even more complex data. And here's another example of small multiples. You'd usually use small multiples for more complex data types, but as you can see here, you can even use it for simple comparisons if you want to emphasize each data point. There are even more chart types than these, but I think we've covered a lot. Returning to our data viz principles, let's end in a full circle by noting that we must always put the audience first. We begin with the audience in mind, and when designing and iterating, you need to continually remind yourself of the audience point of view. First and foremost, you want to make it easy and accessible. Always try to put yourself in your audience's shoes and think about what it's like to encounter data for the first time. Sometimes we spend so much time with data that we forget what it looks like to someone who's unfamiliar with it, which is why it can be so helpful to get someone, even if it's just a coworker, to look at things. But you can also just exercise empathy and make sure that the basics are covered. For example, that labels are readable. You may also want to remember your specific audience. For example, colors have different meanings depending on culture or even local context. I'm originally from New York, home of the Yankees and Mets. And even though I don't really follow baseball, I will probably never be able to see the combination of orange and blue and not think of the Mets. When you're making something for an organization you're working with, you may want to use the organization's colors. You'll see that VISTA is very intentional about its color use, with the AmeriCorps blue and red often used in webinars and other materials.
All right, so we've covered a lot, and now it's a time for you to apply a little bit of what you've learned. So we've got a little data table here. Looking at that data, what kind of chart do you think might work well with this type of data? So you've probably seen a poll pop up on the screen. Pick the best choice, click submit, and then we will see how you all did. Looks like not quite half of you have responded, so we're going to keep this open. We've got 4 options there. Would this make sense as a stacked bar chart, a pie chart, a bar chart, or a donut chart? And well,
Okay.
still a number of you have yet to weigh in, so I'll give you about like 15 more seconds. If you're not able to see the poll, if you're on a mobile device, the poll won't show up. You can certainly just drop your answer in the chat.
Okay, this was a tricky question. It looks like the majority of people did get bar chart. Some people said stacked bar chart, and that's reasonable. In a way, this is a part of a whole, but one thing to note is that there are 8 categories here. So as I mentioned previously, once you have more than 5 or so categories, it gets a little difficult. So this would probably look better as something that's more like the employers, by sector chart. That in a sense could also be seen as parts of a whole because it's all employees, but it's a lot of categories. So having a bar chart would make it a lot easier. Now let's go through.
Right,
oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say you all did great. So thanks for that.
Yeah, that was a trick question. So good job. Now let's go through a quick example of how to design a data visualization. Since we want this to be quick, we'll start with some of the preparatory steps done. So what we have is the data. Here we're going to take a break from the Arizona data and use publicly available data from the Red Cross about its 2017 budget for Hurricane Florence. This is sort of a proxy for the kind of data you may work with at your own nonprofit, though your project budgets are probably not $50 million. For the audience, we're going to pretend that we want to share this budget data with the nonprofit board of directors. Our purpose is to show that the money will be well spent and go to the intended purpose. And the format is a static chart. Let's say just 1 or 2 slides that are being added to a slide deck for a board meeting. Now there's one more step you need to prepare before you can get into design and iterate, and that's figuring out what your story is. So you may want to start with creating a headline, which can help you select the right data. Or you may start by selecting the data you want to emphasize and crafting a headline from that. You may also go back and forth between these actions. I'm going to start to speak a little bit more quickly now because I see that we're going a little long on time. So let's go. But let's say you've decided you want the headline to be about how most of the budget went to program expenses. You have a ton of data, but in order to get this headline across, you only need 2 data points: the percent of the budget that went to program expenses and the percent that went to other expenses like management and fundraising. So you create a new table that only has these 2 data points, click Insert Chart, and see what Excel recommends. And here, one of the options is a pretty straightforward donut chart that shows the program expenses far outweigh overhead expenses. You add a meaningful title and you consider it done.
Right, so we want to get you engaged in this design process as well. So as Tina said, this is a fine visual, but how could we make it even better? So use the chat this time and share what you think would make this a little bit clearer. Again, make sure you're sending to everyone so that your colleagues can see. All right, a couple of you have already said data labels. What else? Do it as a stacked bar chart instead. Add the percentages for each section.
Great observations.
Yeah,
so you can add direct labels was the first thing people said, and that's really great. Some other things you can do is just use a bigger font. Choose colors that emphasize what's in the headline, and let's move ahead with our design. So when refining, you think about data visualization principles. Is there chart junk here? There's not much, but we have a legend, when it would probably be easier to have a direct label. Your purpose, are there stronger ways to emphasize your point? One thing that strikes me is that the little blue piece on top kind of sticks out and draws your attention, which is kind of the opposite of what you want. How can we change this so the overall message that most funds are going to programs is what stands out? And then of course you want to look at accessibility. Is this readable for people who are colorblind? If you're putting this out in grayscale, is everything the same level of saturation? So it would be difficult to actually see the difference between the categories. So here's what happened when we started experimenting and iterating. We start with a perfectly decent, if unnecessarily Mets-themed visual, but it's got some chart junk. The colors aren't ideal, and while the title gets to the heart of what we're trying to say, the visual sort of misses the point. Here we have an updated version where we've eliminated chart junk, adding direct labels. We then made the donut fatter so that it's easier to compare the two parts of the circle. Finally, we changed the color scheme so that it's a little easier to see if you print it out. And we've modified the colors and orientation to draw attention to our primary point, that most funding is going to programs. Just a quick disclaimer that I don't necessarily think that spending money on overhead expenses as opposed to direct is necessarily bad. People sometimes overstate the importance of that. But in this example, this is a very simplified way of looking at how expenses are separated. So I think we can skip through maybe the next example. This was going in a slightly deeper dive into expenses. And so you go back to the selecting your data and select more data. Here I started with a bar chart, so we can just click through. And then, experimented a little until I got, I said pie charts are not usually the answer. This is an option if you do have 4 or 5 categories and you want to use a pie chart. It's something called an exploded pie, and it's native to Excel, so that makes it a little easier to use sometimes. And the point here is that we've used color, again, in a strategic way so that we're sort of showing what's the immediate assistance in blue, the long-term assistance in green, and that gray, which is sort of underemphasized, is the management and fundraising expenses. Okay.
All right, so we have one more quick check for you so you can see how well you've been following along. Looking at this visualization, what might be a better way to represent these data? Would it be a donut chart, exploded pie chart, butterfly chart, or a line chart? So again, the poll should have popped up. If it doesn't, you can either click the More button or the 3 dots at the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer. If you're on a mobile phone, the poll will not be available, so you can use the chat there. Give you maybe about 15 or 20 more seconds to respond to this, so we can give most of you a chance to participate. And looks like the responses are slowed down, so we'll go ahead and reveal the answer, which is a line chart, right? So this has data over time, and as we saw earlier, a line chart is often the best way to do that. So thanks very much for participating in that little activity. And back to you, Gina, to do some wrap up.
All right, great. So we've covered a lot, and I like to share some resources and wrap up with a few concluding thoughts. Here are some resources that you might find helpful. If you're interested in the data used in examples throughout this presentation, links to the data sources can be found in the handout for the session. And then we also have resources on data visualization. So Stephanie Evergreen, so there's ugly charts, which I used some examples of here, which has some interesting things, but more importantly, next one, we have Stephanie Evergreen's website, which is useful, and especially her data visualization checklist, which you can download as a PDF to reference when making charts. Then there's the Which Chart or Graph is Right for You guide from Tableau. It requires that at least one person sign up in order to download the PDF, but then you can share it. And for more information about accessibility, the Create section of the Federal 508 compliance website has extensive guidance for making sure that products, including documents and presentations, are accessible to people with disabilities. The same site also has a section on different methods for testing for 508 compliance, which is especially important if you're making products that will be published by the federal government. And in conclusion, data visualization can be uniquely impactful, informative, and meaningful. There are 2 main types. Oh, can you click? Thank you. There are 2 main types of purposes for data visualization, editorial and informational, and it helps to know which one you're aiming for. Making a data visualization includes preparing, designing, and refining. Finally, it helps to know basic principles of data visualization, like less is usually more, use color effectively, know what works for your data and what doesn't, and always put the audience first. Thank you.
All right. Well, Gina, thank you so much for this presentation. And for all of our participants, we're going to get to your questions in just a moment. But first, I want to invite you to complete a short evaluation for the webinar. Your feedback helps us to make the sessions more useful for you as well as for others. That survey is probably already open in your browser window, but if not, we've posted or will post the link in the chat so you can get to it. But now we want to hear questions that you might have. So we're using the chat feature for that. You can post your question there. We had a question, actually a couple of questions that came in to the chat earlier. So Gina, the question was, what would be the best way to visualize data on how often appointments were missed?
So I'm going to try to guess what you have there. I think it sounds like a simple comparison. So you have, if you're looking at, it's hard for me to know this without context. How often were appointments missed? If you're looking at the number of people who had a certain number of missed appointments, I would probably go with a simple bar chart, or one of those simpler ones, because you're going to have like, this many people missed 0 appointments, X number of people missed 1 appointment and so on. And you would probably have that as a column or bar chart because it's a simple comparison. If you were looking at change over time, that would be more of a line chart.
Okay, great. What about how to communicate how many days past the deadline something was done, and then any events that occurred in between the original deadline and the actual time it was turned in? So it sounds like this is a project management
This
thing,
is more of a, and then now we get into the other kinds of charts like Gantt charts and timelines. So that sounds more like a timeline. It's not really, the data points are moments in time rather than quantities. So probably it would be, it would be more of a timeline if I'm understanding the question correctly.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's hard. And I know you probably can look at a data set and figure out right away, but without the data in front of you, you have to kind of try to fill in some blanks. All right, we've got a couple more questions. One is, as a novice, would you recommend Google Sheets or Excel to compartmentalize data?
That's a great question. And 100%, if you can get Excel, use Excel. It's much easier for chart making. It has a lot more flexibility. Obviously, Google Sheets is free, so that's a plus. And if your organization uses, so we'll use Google Sheets sometimes because our organization uses Google products a lot and Google Slides. So in that case, but it's way easier to use Excel, and it has a lot more functions. Okay. Yeah, any day of the week.
And then related to that, another sort of recommendation questions. What are the best websites for developing charts?
Websites for developing charts. So, I mean, I'm not sure if you mean like developing charts on the website itself or like for ways to recommend charts. I would direct you back to the resources for both of those. I think that, Stephanie Evergreen is my go-to for anything on ways to make charts. She, especially using Excel. She's in the part of the evaluation community. And so she really understands how to work with, nonprofits and other kinds of organizations in this way, and has some creative ways of using Excel. If you want, Tableau has good resources, but it's also a way of creating interactive visualizations. It's a lot more advanced. But if you wanted to experiment with interactive dashboards, especially with publicly available data, that's what I would recommend.
Great. Okay. Yeah. And I think you're on the right track because Marcus hopped back in and said he's interested in ways to make charts. It sounds like Stephanie Evergreen's site will be really useful.
Mm-hmm.
And then Mariah says, I'm working on a large scale community survey. How many dimensions are too many before it's time to break it into smaller multiples?
That's a great question. That's a great question. And you'll know, basically, if you try to make it into a clustered bar chart and it's just visually overwhelming, then that's a hint that it'll be better off to break into small multiples. You know, I'm not going to put a specific number on it, but once you have more than like 3 by 4, you know, or categories, it starts to get a little crazy. Or when you have 3-layer categories, like small multiples are often the best choice, unless you just want to go with a conditionally formatted table, which you can make in Excel, which, you know, maybe isn't quite as pretty, but that's the easiest way to create like very fast, still sort of readable, extremely complex data is probably a conditionally formatted table. But yeah, hope that helps.
All right, we've got a few more that have come in. We still have some time. Janice asks, would you recommend charts for email updates to display attendance or progress, or would factoids be better?
Oh, yay. I'm glad you mentioned factoids. I don't know if that's really a word. It's a word that we use at our organization to describe, you know, those little bits of data. For email updates, I think I probably would just go with factoids. You know, people don't want a lot to download a bunch of things into their email unnecessarily. And it's extra effort to make an update chart. So I would say, unless you are really trying to campaign and to show people like, look, you have to increase, like we use charts once with AmeriCorps, actually, working with organizations to track how whether their surveys had been coming back, like how many of them versus a goal. And so if you're really putting a lot of effort towards trying to convince people to do something, then you might want to go that extra step. But most of the time, I think a factoid would be fine.
All right, great. Felt like Jacqueline is putting together an annual report with different categories and asks, should we try to have as many of the charts reflect similar style for aesthetics?
That's a great question. People often will want to put a lot of variety, and that's why we end up with pie charts that should not be pie charts. And I think it's a balance. There's pros and cons to variety. I think in terms of aesthetics, you always do want to keep a similar, like, for example, color scheme, or, you know, look or font. You definitely want some consistency there. But in terms of chart style, I think don't be too afraid, especially if you're doing something like a board presentation, to do you know, several of the same kinds of charts. It'll make your life easier, and it's also easier to process. For a report, especially something that's going to be used widely, for example, for the Women in the Workplace report that we have a ton of different charts because we're also trying to keep people's attention. But if you have a captive audience, you don't have to worry about that as much. I think, you know, for your standard presentation, if you have similar types of data, you know, maybe have 2 or 3 different chart styles and don't go out of your way. If every chart is a bar chart, yeah, it's a little boring, but it's also a lot easier to read. So especially if it's identical data, you want to use the same chart style. If it's slightly different types of data, then you want to vary up your chart styles. And then sometimes you want to vary up your chart style just for fun. I hope that helps.
All right, sounds like great advice. And yeah, there's so many options, and you talked really about a lot of different ways to present data, and, you know, different ways to determine which kind of chart is going to work with your data. I'll put in another plug for the handout. There is a table there that Gina provided, so that tells you if you have different types of data. It gives you ideas about the types of charts, or that would make most sense for those data types or the kind of comparisons you're looking to make. All right, so I don't see any other questions.
Appreciate all the questions.
Here.
Yeah.
yeah, great questions. I don't see any more right now. So I want to do a little plug for our next webinar. It's going to be in January. Not on January, we're in January right now. It's on February 10th. And it takes a look at some practical approaches for member recruitment. and I hope that we will see you there. Again, Gina, I want to thank you so much for all of your great work and expertise putting this presentation together and sharing it with us today. Again, Gina Cartazone of the Sheryl Sandberg and Dave Goldberg Family Foundation. I also want to thank our production team that includes Steve Gray and Colby Wilson, as well as our captioners for all of their support today, and to Bethany DeSablin for her instructional design assistance. Thank you all for joining. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.